Hey everyone, welcome to Hands on Books. I was on a subreddit the other day where people post pictures of their bookshelves, and this one person had posted theirs, and it was just like a complete disaster. Piles of books everywhere, totally unorganized, and people were calling it a hoarding situation more than a collecting situation. So I started looking at my room and my bookshelves and found that I was probably doing the same thing. So I went through and boxed a ton of books up and rearranged everything and cleaned up my space, and it feels really good, and I feel ready to dive into this enormous pile of unopened books that I have next to me. So let's get started. So this is I.A.F by Philip Short. Mark Ames from Radio War Nerd talked about this being one of the best nonfiction books he's ever read, so I decided to pick it up. After the Nationalists routed a ragtag Red Army on the Jiang River during the Long March in 1934, an earthy Chinese peasant with a brilliant mind moved to a position of power. 8 years later, Mao Zedong had won out over more orthodox politicians to become party chairman, his title for life. In this meticulously researched account, the author draws on extensive interviews and on a wealth of previously secret documentary material to present for the first time a complete portrait of this bewilderingly complex and versatile leader. He traces Mao's development from idealistic student to visionary despot whose epic struggle to build a revolutionary realm of red virtue took the lives of more of his subjects than did any other leader in human history, Hitler and Stalin included. Philip Short illuminates the crucial episodes in Mao's life and career that until now have been deliberately obscured, including a secret blood purge that Mao personally launched in the 1930s, his Byzantine struggles with Russia, and decisive role in the outbreak of the Korean War, and the chairman's machinations and imperial behavior that resulted in the cataclysmic Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong was a defining figure of the 20th century, a man of awesome vision and power whose life was played out on so vast a canvas that his great contemporaries seem minor by comparison. Military strategist, fiendishly clever politician, poet and philosopher, he transformed China and changed the world. The revolution he engineered dragged almost a quarter of humankind out of medieval squalor and splendor into the modern age. One cannot understand today's China without first understanding Mao. Philip Short has been a foreign correspondent for the London Times, The Economist, and the BBC in the world's major capitals. He worked in China in the 1970s and early 1980s, and has returned there regularly ever since. He now lives in southern France. Not sure if that's still true. Few people today, even in China, have heard of the little market town of Tongdao. It extends for about a mile along the left bank of the Shuangjiang, squeezed into a narrow strip of land between the wide brown river and a range of terraced hills. Tongdao is the center of a small non-Han minority area where the three provinces of Guangxi, Guizhou, and Hunan meet. It is a scruffy, run-down place with one long, muddy main street, few shops, and fewer modern buildings, where even the locals say resignedly that nothing of interest ever happens. Yet once something did happen there. On December 12, 1934, the Red Army leadership gathered in Tongdao for a meeting which was to mark the beginning of Mao Zedong's rise to supreme power. It was one of the most obscure events in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. The only written trace of the Red Army's passage is an old photograph of a faded slogan, chalked up by the troops on a wall. Quote, "Everyone should take up arms and fight the Japanese," end quote. All the participants are now dead. No one knows exactly who was present, or even where the meeting took place. Premier Zhou Enlai, years later, recalled that it had been in a farmhouse, somewhere outside the town, where a wedding party was in progress. Mao was 2 weeks short of his 41st birthday, a thin, lanky man, hollow-cheeked from lack of food and sleep, whose oversized gray cotton jacket seemed perpetually about to slide from his shoulders. He was still recovering from a severe bout of malaria, and at times had to be carried in a litter. Taller than most of the other leaders, his face was smooth and unmarked, with a shock of unruly black hair parted in the middle. The left-wing American writer, Agnes Smedley, who met Mao not long afterwards, found him a forbidding figure, with a high-pitched voice and long, sensitive woman's hands. Quote, "His dark, inscrutable face was long, the forehead broad and high, the mouth feminine. Whatever else he might be, he was an aesthete. But despite that feminine quality in him, he was as stubborn as a mule, and a steel rod of pride and determination ran through his nature. I had the impression that he would wait and watch for years, but eventually have his way. His humor was often sardonic and grim, as though it sprang from deep caverns of spiritual seclusion. I had the impression that there was a door to his being that had never been opened to anyone." Even to his closest comrades, Mao was hard to fathom. His spirit, in Smedley's words, dwelt within itself, isolating him. His personality inspired loyalty, not affection. He combined a fierce temper and infinite patience, vision, and an almost pedantic attention to detail, an inflexible will, an extreme subtlety, public charisma, and private intrigue. I love that. It's hard to stop reading, but I'm gonna. All right. Next. Oh, cool. Can't remember what caused me to buy this one. I love Zelazny, especially Lord of Light, and Lord of Light's probably my favorite, but This Immortal was really cool, and so was the one where he did the Egyptian mythology, Creatures of Light and Darkness, I think it is. So this is Roadmarks. The last exit to Babylon. The road runs from the unimaginable past to the far future, and those who travel it have access to the turnoffs leading to all times and places, even to the alternate time streams of histories that never happened. Why the dragons of Belquineth made the road, or who they are, no one knows, but the road has always been there, for those who know how to find it, and always will be. Zelazny is just so creative. I've never read the Chronicles of Amber, but and of course he starts in chapter 2. "Pull over," cried Layla. Randy cut to the right immediately and braked the car. The sky pulsed its way to a pearly pre-dawn. "Back up along the shoulder." He nodded and shifted into reverse. "Those people? We could just walk back. I want to look at them more closely before we get out." "Okay," he said as they crept backward. She turned and regarded the battered gray vehicle. There were 2 figures seated within it. Both seemed to be white-haired, but the light was still tricky. Both seemed to be watching her. "In a moment the door on the driver's side will open," she said softly. The door on the driver's side opened. Now the other door opened. The old man was driving, the old woman a passenger. An old man and an old woman stepped out and moved forward, leaving the doors open behind them. They wore ragged wraparound garments held in place with sashes. "Stop," she said. "Let's get out and go back and help them. Their distributor cap has come loose." "A part of your vision?" "No," she said. She opened the door, got out, and headed back. He did the same. His first impression, as he approached, was that the man was too old to be driving. Stoop-shouldered, he leaned against his car. His free hand trembled slightly. It was dry and spotted, claw-like. His face was heavily lined, his eyebrows as white as his hair. Then the eyes caught Randy and held him, green, almost flashing. There was an awareness there at which he would not have guessed from 3 meters farther back. Randy smiled at him, but the man showed no reaction. Okay, let's keep going. This is another book on Sri Ramakrishna. The Light of the Modern World, The Universal Significance of Sri Ramakrishna's Avatarahood and Message, by Swami Bhajanananda. Sri Ramakrishna is regarded variously as a saint, sage, spiritual leader, world teacher, prophet, avatara of the present age, and so on. Finding these terms unsatisfactory, the noted British author Christopher Isherwood described Sri Ramakrishna as a phenomenon. The present book is a modest attempt to understand that phenomenon in the context of world thought currents and in the light of authentic sources. Who was Sri Ramakrishna? What was the purpose of his advent? What is the true dimension of his personality? Was he an avatara? What is the role of an avatara? Devotees, followers, and admirers of Sri Ramakrishna encounter these questions at some juncture of their life's journey. And in the answer to these questions lies the opening to the realm of an ineffable light, which is the light of the modern world. Sri Ramakrishna's message was unique in being expressed in action. The message itself was the perennial message of Hinduism. In the Hindu view, each of the higher religions is a true vision and a right way, and all of them alike are indispensable to mankind, because each gives a different glimpse of the same truth, and each leads by a different route to the same goal of human endeavors. Each, therefore, has a special spiritual value of its own, which is not to be found in any of the others. And a quote from Arnold Toynbee: Ramakrishna practiced successively almost every form of Indian religion and philosophy, and he went on to practice Islam and Christianity as well. His religious activity and experience were, in fact, comprehensive to a degree that had perhaps never before been attained by any other religious genius in India or elsewhere. And Swami Bhajanananda is a senior trustee of Ramakrishna Math and member of the governing body of the Ramakrishna Mission. He was formerly an editor of Prabuddha Bharata for several years, and is currently an assistant secretary of the Worldwide Ramakrishna Math and Ramakrishna Mission in Belur Math. Sri Ramakrishna, the known and the unknown. An incarnation of God has two aspects, one the historical or temporal, and the other the transcendent and eternal. A study of the biography of Sri Ramakrishna gives us knowledge only of the former aspect of his nature, while the latter aspect is unknown to us and can be known only through his direct self-revelation. In this prologue, we wish to point out that in evaluating the significance of the mission of Sri Ramakrishna on earth, we must take into account both the known and the unknown aspects of his nature. The timeless adoration. When the sun sinks behind the western skyline, when shadows thicken and merge in the enveloping gloom, when from the horizon the carpet of stillness spreads across the twilit world, a simple ritual is performed in scores of ashramas and in thousands of homes in adoration of a being known to the world as Sri Ramakrishna. In a special room or corner of a room set apart for his unseen presence, incense is burnt and lights are waved, and often there is group singing of songs and hymns of praise and supplication. A religious ritual is a sacrament. Behind it there is a sacralizing agent whose power sustains it for centuries. Through the ritual, past events are recreated in the minds of devotees, and they encounter divine phenomena afresh. When the devotees of Sri Ramakrishna do puja, ritualistic worship, or arati, evening worship or vespers, in their dwelling places, each place of worship becomes in a mystic sense his room at Dakshineswar temple garden. Time, as it were, stands still and history is transcended when Sri Ramakrishna accepts, as his devotees believe, their worship day after day. For the time being, there then exists only an eternal now. Such is the miracle that faith works through religious rituals. A ritual, however, is only a temporal expression of the timeless aspiration of the human soul. Birth after birth, through trackless centuries, mankind has been knowingly or unknowingly adoring the divine in some form or another. It is in response to this timeless aspiration of the human soul that the divine incarnates again and again on earth. The God-hungry soul seizes upon these manifestations and tries to derive new meaning and direction regarding its own progress in life. Every word that an incarnation utters becomes a message of light. Every gesture of his promise a hope. Every action a sacrament, and every place the incarnation visits is a center of pilgrimage. This is true of all the great incarnations of the past, Rama and Krishna, Buddha and Christ, and has now come to be true in the case of Sri Ramakrishna. And I can't have too many books on Sri Ramakrishna, in my opinion. So this is Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts, recommended by someone I work with. Gregory David Roberts was born in Melbourne, Australia. Sentenced to 19 years in prison for a series of armed robberies, he escaped and spent 10 of his fugitive years in Bombay, where he established a free medical clinic for slum dwellers, and worked as a counterfeiter, smuggler, gun runner, and street soldier for a branch of the Bombay Mafia. Recaptured, he served out his sentence and established a successful multimedia company upon his release. Roberts is now a full-time writer and lives in Bombay. Reminds me of Papillon. Chapter 1. It took me a long time in most of the world to learn what I know about love and fate and the choices we make, but the heart of it came to me in an instant, while I was chained to a wall and being tortured. I realized somehow, through the screaming in my mind, that even in that shackled, bloody helplessness, I was still free. Free to hate the men who were torturing me, or to forgive them. It doesn't sound like much, I know, but in the flinch and bite of the chain, when it's all you've got, that freedom is a universe of possibility. And the choice you make between hating and forgiving can become the story of your life. In my case, it's a long story and a crowded one. I was a revolutionary who lost his ideals in heroin, a philosopher who lost his integrity in crime, and a poet who lost his soul in a maximum security prison. When I escaped from that prison, over the front wall, between two gun towers, I became my country's most wanted man. Luck ran with me and flew with me across the world to India, where I joined the Bombay Mafia. I worked as a gun runner, a smuggler, and a counterfeiter. I was chained on 3 continents, beaten, stabbed, and starved. I went to war, I ran into the enemy guns, and I survived, while other men around me died. They were better men than I am, most of them. Better men whose lives were crunched up in mistakes and thrown away by the wrong second of someone else's hate, or love, or indifference. And I buried them, too many of those men, and grieved their stories and their lives into my own. But my story doesn't begin with them, or with the Mafia. It goes back to that first day in Bombay. Fate put me in the game there. Luck dealt the cards that led me to Carla Saarinen. And I started to play it out, that hand, from the first moment I looked into her green eyes. So it begins, this story, like everything else, with a woman and a city and a little bit of luck. Wow. Fantastic. All right. Looks pretty. Gray Eminence by Aldous Huxley. I was looking up, reading a Wikipedia article or something on this guy and interested in getting a book about him. Then I saw one was written by Huxley. I was like, awesome. This was like Cardinal Richelieu's right-hand man during the 30 Years' War period. So we're talking early 17th century, and Richelieu was the red, his nickname was the Red Eminence, because he always wore red cardinal's robes, I guess, and this guy was was called the Gray Eminence. Eminence Grise. Oh yeah, and his name was Francois Leclerc du Tremblay. And if I understand correctly, he was, like one of these cloak and dagger spies. There's this fantastic painting of him walking down the steps of some palace in France, and I'll post it, where all these noblemen are doffing their caps and bowing, and he's just sort of walking down the steps, not looking at any of them, but reading from his Bible or something like that. It's a pretty impressive painting. and really gives you the idea that these people who are at the very top of the society will respect and fear this monk. Chapter 1, On the Road to Rome. The friar had kilted up his habit, and his bare legs were muddy to the knees. After the spring rains, the road was like a swamp. It had been like a lime kiln, he reflected, last time he walked this way. He recalled the poem he had written on another of his journeys. When, at day's hottest hour, the burning dog-star makes a furnace of the air, my roving feet affront the swarthy regions of the earth, though I be streaming with sweat. That summer of 1618, when the three of them had taken the road for Spain, poor brother Zeno of Guincamp had died of sunstroke at Toulouse. And a week later, near Burgos, Father Romanos had fallen sick with dysentery. In 3 days it was all over. He had limped into Madrid alone, and alone he was now to limp into Rome, for Father Angelus had had to be left behind with the Capuchins of Viterbo, too sick of the ague? I've never seen that word. Of the ague to walk another step. God bring him soon to health again. And then another poem. The aspiring crests of the snowy Alps and Pyrenees have not sufficed to limit my long marches that aim at the very heavens. Read a little bit more, because that didn't give me too good of an idea. Continuation of that poem. Dear Lord, if it is thy hand which has penetrated me with the wound of this piercing design, I have the right to show thee my tender hurt and to unveil my breast. The wound of this piercing design, he repeated to himself. The phrase was particularly felicitous, almost Latin in its pregnancy, like one of those phrases of Prudentius. The Capuchin sighed profoundly. That wound, he reflected, was still open, and goaded by the barb of God's piercing design, he was still hurrying, at the rate of 15 leagues a day, across the face of Europe. When would that design be carried into execution? When would it be granted to another Godfrey of Bouillon to storm Jerusalem? Not yet a while, to all appearances, not till the wars were over, not till the House of Austria should be humbled and France grow strong enough to lead the nations on the new crusade. How long, O Lord, how long? This seems fun. Let's see when this book's from. It's from 75. Looks like a really nice copy. It smells pretty fresh. Really cool though. Grendel by John Gardner. I read this in high school, and it was one of the ones that I actually really liked. Retelling the Beowulf story from the perspective of the monster. And if the babe is born a boy, he's given to a woman old, who nails him down upon a rock, catches his shrieks in cups of gold. By William Blake. We have underlines, dang it. Oh well, let's read the first page. The old ram stands looking down over rock slides, stupidly triumphant. I blink. I stare in horror. Scat, I hiss. Go back to your cave, go back to your cowshed, whatever. He cocks his head like an elderly, slow-witted king, considers the angles, decides to ignore me. I stamp. I hammer the ground with my fists. I hurl a skull-sized stone at him. He will not budge. I shake my 2 hairy fists at the sky, and I let out a howl so unspeakable that the water at my feet turns sudden ice, and even I myself am left uneasy. But the ram stays, the season is upon us, and so begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. I like that detail of the water turning to ice. The pain of it, the stupidity. Ah well, I sigh and shrug, trudge back to the trees. Do not think my brains are squeezed shut, like the ram's, by the root of horns. flanks a tremble, eyes like stones. He stares at as much of the world as he can see and feels it surging in him, filling his chest as the melting snow fills dried-out creek beds, tickling his gross, lopsided balls and charging his brains with the same unrest that made him suffer last year at this time, and the year before, and the year before that. He's forgotten them all. His hind parts shiver with the usual joyful, mindless ache to mount whatever happens near. The storm piling up black towers to the west, some rotting, docile stump, some spraddle-legged yew. I cannot bear to look. Why can't these creatures discover a little dignity, I ask the sky. The sky says nothing, predictably. I make a face, uplift a defiant middle finger, and give an obscene little kick. The sky ignores me, forever unimpressed. Him too I hate, the same as I hate these brainless budding trees, these brattling birds. Disappointed in the underlining, but oh well. So this is Commentary on Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, an anonymous history that tells a similar story as the one that's covered in things like Xenophon's Hellenica, that covers the period after, or the latter period of the Peloponnesian War at least, and the period after the Peloponnesian War. And I'd never even heard of this source, so I figured I would buy something. Introduction. The Papyri. Two separate papyrus discoveries made at Oxyrhynchus form the portions which we possess of the work of a Greek historian whose identity has not been established, and whose history is consequently known as the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia. The larger of the two papyri was discovered in 1906 and was first published in 1908 by B.P. Grendel and A.S. Hunt as P. Oxy 842 in Volume 5 of Oxyrhynchus Papyri. It is now housed in the British Museum as Papyrus 1843 in the Department of Manuscripts. It originally consisted of about 230 fragments of varying size, which were pieced together by the first editors so as to leave only some 57 small fragments unplaced. The papyrus contains some sections of the Greek history dealing in considerable detail with events of the Greek world in 396 to 395 BC. But this seems like kind of boring information. Let me keep going. The new fragments appear without doubt to have been the main source entirely independent of Xenophon, used by Ephorus and through him by Diodorus, for the years to which the fragments refer, 410 to 407 BC. The Oxyrhynchus historian intended his work to be a continuation of Thucydides' history, and that his narrative therefore began with the events of 411 BC. Section 2, the Hellenica, the scope of its history and its date of composition. If one cannot state with absolute certainty the points at which the narrative of the Hellenica began and terminated, one can, at least, make a very reasonable conjecture about the scope of the work from the available evidence. In the London Papyrus, the author refers back to his earlier mention of a sea battle near Amphipolis in which Timoleus, the Corinthian, defeated an Athenian general whose name appears to have been Symmachus. The most likely date for this episode is the latter part of 411 BC. In other words, shortly after the point at which Thucydides' history comes to an end. It seems to have been P's practice, when making a passing reference to a subject he had previously dealt with, to indicate that he had done so by the use of a phrase such as, a bunch of Greek, while recalling certain consequences of the Spartan occupation of Decelea. He gives no such notice of a form or treatment of these matters, and it has been sensibly suggested that the narrative to which P's note here is supplementary is not his own, but that of Thucydides. This is not, of course, conclusive proof that P has not given an account of the beginning of the Decelean War himself, for at 14.2, in a note on the inadequacy of Persian financial support to the Spartan fleet at that period, P omits to cite a passage which must surely have been contained in his earlier narrative. Okay, I don't want to read this anymore. Not on the show, but It's a cool book to have. Okay, next. And the last one. I'm going to pick from the old stack. A History of Ancient Egypt by Nicolas Grimal. This account of the rise and fall of civilization in the Nile Valley is the first detailed reign-by-reign history of ancient Egypt to be published in English since Sir Alan Gardner's Egypt of the Pharaohs in 1961. Nicolas Grimal's description of the political and economic history of the Egyptians is recounted within the framework of an intricate and well-argued chronology. At a time when the vast accumulation of information from ancient Egypt is becoming almost too diverse for a single author to encompass, Grimal successfully transforms the raw archaeological sources into a coherent historical sequence. From the first human settlement in the Nile Valley, circa 120,000 BC, to the appearance of Alexander the Great in 331, this history blends archaeological and textual evidence into a lucid and informed narrative. Numerous quotes from the original documentary sources, such as the funerary autobiographies of individuals and the official royal accounts of military campaigns, add a strong sense of atmosphere to the unfolding events. And Nicolas Grimal was formerly a researcher at the French Institute of Oriental Antiquity in Cairo and is currently professor of Egyptology at the Sorbonne University in Paris. Ian Shaw, the translator, is Leverhulme Research Fellow in Archaeology at New Hall, Cambridge. Just read the first page of the intro. The compilation of a history of pharaonic Egypt is no longer as much of an adventure as it was at the turn of the century, when scientism was at its height, and Gaston Maspero wrote his monumental work, History of the Peoples of the Ancient Orient. Maspero's work, along with James Henry Breasted's History of Egypt, still forms the basis for most modern historical syntheses. It was not so long ago, however, that the combined influence of the Bible and the classical tradition conspired to produce a rather incoherent view of Egyptian civilization, and the great chronological disputes inherited from the 19th century are a continuing legacy of this confusion. The disputes were generally between the adherents of a so-called long chronology, based on a fairly unscientific use of textual sources, and those who proposed a short chronology, which was founded on a less romantic and more archaeological view of history. Now, however, virtually all scholars adhere to the short chronology. Although there is currently broad agreement on the course of its first 2,000 years, recent advances in research have revived the problem of the beginnings of Egyptian history and the origins of pharaonic civilization. Despite the fact that Egyptology is one of the youngest of the historical disciplines, if it is considered to have begun with the work of Champollion 150 years ago, the increasing use of modern scientific methods has placed it in the forefront of research into the origins of civilization. Pharaonic culture has always been a source of fascination, even to those unable to understand the profundity of a system in which everything gives an impression of permanence and unchanging wisdom. The Greek travelers were particularly guilty of misinterpretation. Unable to convey a true sense of Egypt's basic values to their Greek audience, they intended instead to use Egypt as a vehicle for the ideas which already interested them. They presented it as an impressive and mysterious fountainhead of human thought, where a remarkably advanced level of civilization had been achieved, but they clearly regarded Egyptian civilization simply as a stage in the development towards the perfect Greek version. Their descriptions of Egyptian culture were characterized both by unbridled enthusiasm and by a distinct sense of uncertainty when they were confronted by customs of which they invariably misunderstood the origins. All right. Well, hope you enjoyed that one. Might have been introduced to a topic or title you didn't know about before, and if this is something that you liked, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, happy reading.